Hey, so God bless you, everybody. We are back. It is night 2 out of the 4 of our online urban apologetics conference. Titus got it there. Y'all go throw him up. So Adam is in here. So we do this thing, Adam, where I tell them snap your fingers. Because everybody can't say amen when they mute it. So if they hear me, if you rocking with me, if everything is good, we do the snap your fingers. Not like Lil Jon. I know everybody watched the Super Bowl. This is the Poetry Club. Snap your fingers. Not like if we say Lil Jon, then people will start getting the rhythm in their head, and then they'll have to repent and and come on back in. So we just do snap your fingers like like the Poetry Club. But this is night 2. I was really blessed, just thinking all day, talking with my team and a lot of the people that were here last night. How many of you all were blessed last night by Dr. Eric Mason? You had a good time and everything. We had a wonderful, wonderful time. So it's just amazing. This dream at this conference, as we said last night, it really has been a dream come true. And I don't want anybody to get any kind of notion that things are going to drop off after Dr. Mason. We still got a whole week full of and weekend full of just dynamic heavy hitters in the apologetics and urban apologetics arena. And tonight is going to be no different. I got turned on to Adam. I can't even remember how, but I know I started watching the True ID channel, listening to his podcast, and I really fell in love with how he uses philosophical arguments to make his case when he's doing apologetics. It was something that I hadn't seen before, and I really he's also, for those of you that don't know, he is my wife's favorite apologist. She loves her some Adam Coleman, and that is no joke. When we went to the Truth Conference in Atlanta, Georgia, several years ago, and he was presenting there, and I was like, man, seeing him in person, it was like, man, this guy is really legit. And so I had a couple of questions that I posed to him at the end of his presentation, and the way that he answered them just really impressed my wife. And I'm like, you're supposed to be here for moral support to me, and you all fanning over Adam, but he really is really great in the way that he does apologetics, so knowledgeable. And I remember when I first got into doing my own urban apologetics, one of my first PowerPoints was on slavery in the Bible. And I called Adam up. He was just so gracious to, give me his number. We exchanged information. And, I had been reading all kind of books, studying all kind of stuff. And some of the things that he dropped on me in just the 10 or 15 minutes that we talked, I had to go in real fast and edit my PowerPoint to add them in there. And every time I go over that presentation, I just remember the things that he talked about in there, about how slavery doesn't even fit the character of God, and just different things. And so it was just a eye-opening conversation. And every time that I have a good question, I'll call him up, and he's always so gracious to answer. And so it's just really a pleasure to have him with us on this week. He's going to be talking to us about the moral argument over Black atheism and Kemeticism. So if you're not familiar with those topics, he is definitely one that is well versed in them, and is going to be able to give us solid, great instruction. So don't be apprehensive. Don't be, with your questions and everything. He is more than capable of doing that. If you have not subscribed to his True ID YouTube and podcast, please do so. You can even go back and listen to some old videos that he's done, and it's really solid content. When the stuff about Carlton Pearson came out, he had about 3 videos on there, and I went back and watched those and just listened to his take on those. And so there's just a lot of great content on there. He is an absolute asset to the body of Christ. So everybody here that is taking this class, would you please do me a favor and snap your fingers and welcome our guest on tonight, the one and only Adam Coleman. Hey, God bless you, man. Thank you for being here. The floor is yours, kind sir.
Oh man, I appreciate it, man. And with that intro, I might just log out now. I don't want to mess it up. You know what I'm saying? Like, I need you to come out to all of my events and do the intro, man. That's fantastic. And
I'm gonna be the Steve Harvey of this before you know it, man.
no, I don't know what all this Cat Williams stuff going. I don't know if you want to be Steve. You might want to pick somebody else. You don't want a Cat Williams coming for you. You know what I mean? But yeah, thank you for that introduction, and certainly thank you for just allowing me to be a part of this event. I typically I'm very informed. I just try to talk off the cuff a lot, and I just want to say that this is so beautiful to see just so many people gathered just to learn about defending the faith. Learning about God, this God that we serve, and how to articulate who He is and what He's about to the world. Man, I remember for me about 10 or so years ago, I was really wrestling with the faith myself. there's people in my family asking questions like, is Christianity the white man's religion? And, where was Jesus during slavery, and so on and so forth. And, I realized I didn't have great answers for those questions. And so as I was kind of grappling with it, praise God, by his sovereignty, he brought me the resources that allowed me to answer some of those things, and just put it in my heart to help others to do the same. And so that's really what I'm about, man. I don't see myself as being anything, special. I'm just trying to give people what God gave me. And, but the reality is, like, when I first started, there wasn't anything like the Urban Apologetics Conference. There was nothing like this. We could come across all sorts of memes and claims online with nobody pushing back. But the game has changed now. We've got the Kevin Bettons out here who's got 1 billion subscribers on TikTok, and putting out that heat, you know what I'm saying, and doing what he does. We got the Eric Masons of the world, and wherever I fit into that, I'm really out here just trying to serve Christ, man. And so I'm just really encouraged. I see D New in the building. Shout out to D New. She's going to be presenting next week, as a matter of fact, at the Urban Apologetics Conference. And so we just have so many people who are out here really representing the name of Christ. And I'm just trying to do my part. That's kind of how I see it. So, my name is Adam Coleman. I'm the founder and lead apologist with True ID Apologetics. That stands for The Real You Imago Dei, which is just a fancy way of saying image of God. That's the Imago Dei part. And the mission for True ID is very simple. Our goal is to help Christians to know what they believe, know why they believe it, and how to articulate that to others. That's what we're all about, right? Many of you are probably like myself. Again, I just kind of talk off the cuff, but many of you are probably like myself, in that maybe you've got that cousin or that brother-in-law, that uncle, whose name is Gerald. But last time he came to Thanksgiving dinner, he was Malik Shabazz or Yasharella, Israel or something like that. It's like, come on, Gerald. You know what I mean? We all have a Gerald. I think at least many of us have a Gerald in the family. And we want to learn, we want to give Gerald, the gospel. We want to be able to reach Gerald. Or maybe that's been you, and you just want to seek out a deeper relationship with Christ. And that's what True ID is really all about. When it comes to urban apologetics, I'll just say this. I think that one of the things that's underappreciated about urban apologetics is that it is very different from, I think we might call, I'll just say, general apologetics, that you might encounter, right? I thought that Eric Mason, I was in that session last night, did a phenomenal job of defining urban apologetics. So I really won't spend a lot of time there. But one thing that I want to just kind of submit to you that will kind of get us into where we're headed for the evening is that when you think about the questions that people have, right? When you think about the questions that people have, particularly in the African American context, generally speaking, it has something to do with human persons, right? It has something to do with human persons. When you think about our history, the Dr. Kings of the world, the Harriet Tubmans, the Frederick Douglasses, right? When you think about so many of the key figures in our history here in the West, why is it that they're historically significant, right? In so many ways, they're historically significant because they're morally significant, right? There's a moral struggle with respect to human personhood, right? That they played a role in advancing humanity in that regard, advancing the value of human beings. That's just a linchpin of our history, right? Now, when you think about the questions that people have about Christianity specifically, or about whatever other religion they might be entertaining, so many people are trying to answer questions that relate to human persons and how it is that we have value. What does that mean? Okay. I think that's the heart behind questions like, is Christianity the white man's religion? That's really the heart behind it. If it is the case that you serve a God who doesn't care about Black people, then that can't be the real God. That can't be a God who's morally good, right? And so some way, somehow, there's this hinge of identity and personal value that ties into so many of the questions that people have. And so I'm going to take it back to the scriptures for a moment. You may recall that scene where Jesus is talking to his disciples, And he had some hard sayings. He's like, look, if you don't eat in my flesh and drink in my blood, then you have no part in me. And a lot of people dipped out. It was like, yo, that's a hard saying. I don't know what this brother's talking about. Like, who man's is this? Like, what are we doing right now? Right. And then he looks to the disciples and he says, will you go also? And I want to say it was Peter that responded. He says, to whom shall we go? He didn't say, where shall we go? He said, to whom shall we go? Right. When it comes to seeking out the answers to people's questions, folks are going to go to somebody, right? If it's not to Christ, if it's not to the scriptures, they're going to go to Umar Johnson. They're going to go to, Hebrew Israelite so-and-so. They're going to go to Brother Polite. They're going to go to, I don't know, Joe Budden or Charlemagne from the Breakfast Club. They're going to go to a whom, right? And that's the thing. They're going to seek out the answer to their questions from somebody. Apologetics, then, is not a matter of debate. It's not a matter of, just mic drop moments and proving people wrong. That's really not the essence of what apologetics is about. It's about coming alongside people to illustrate why it is the case that it's Christ who's the person to whom you should go to answer these questions. Christianity has all the resources within it to address the fundamental questions that people have, particularly in the African-American context pertaining to human persons. So that's going to kind of set the stage for where we're going here. All right. With that intro, now I think we're supposed to be going from 6 to 8, and I don't know if that's a Black Baptist church 8, where I got like a Baptist 15 at the end, or if I'm sticking to my time. But I'm going to go ahead and dive into my PowerPoint presentation, and we got a lot of ground to cover. All right, that's by way of intro. So give me 1 second, see if I can get things going here. Okay.
And Adam, as you do that, I couldn't tell last night with Dr. Mason, but if you want to change the gallery view in there so you can see the students and your presentation, feel free to do that, man. I just want to make sure if I change it on my end, it doesn't impact yours.
Okay, cool. I'll find out in a second. I've never tried that before, to be honest with you. So I'll have to see how that pans out. Because I think for whatever reason, with mine, it like takes up the whole screen. I don't know why it does that. So I'm trying to, give me a second here. Of course, it wants to be difficult. I talked all that, had all that build up, and now it wants to give me a hard time. All right, cool. Here we go.
Okay, so I just adjusted mine. Did that impact anything on your side, sir?
I do see a panel of people, like 4 or 5 people to my right.
Okay.
But what I'll probably do is I'll probably just go to that gallery view when we get to the Q&A.
Okay.
If that's all right.
Yes, sir.
But is everybody seeing this right here, or
Yes, sir.
everybody seeing that? Okay, I see the finger snapping. Okay, good. All right. So this screen right here, just really quickly, if you want to just take a second to scan the QR code, that will actually take you to a notes page on my website that has the notes for at least the first section of this presentation. Actually, I need to update it because I've got some new material I don't think I've shared in the presentation before regarding to Kemeticism. So I'll update the notes accordingly. And as I understand, Kevin, I'll be getting this slideshow to you so that people can have that as well. And I'm also working on a PDF that I'll get to you also.
Yes,
so I'll just give people a second. But certainly you may want to take some notes. I'll be here for Q&A. So we definitely want to take some notes in case you have some questions or anything like that. No question is a dumb question. Today, or at least today, we'll entertain all kind of questions. Curiosity is a virtue as far as I'm concerned. So, feel free to ask whatever questions you need. All right. Okay. So we want to talk about the God question, right? Now, I want to say at the outset that sometimes it can be tempting for us to, this thing is not letting me. Okay, there we go. Sometimes it's tempting for us to maybe pass over, the God question, particularly in African American circles, because the reality is atheism is not so much of it doesn't hold a whole lot of sway, at least right now, in African American circles. And I'm saying African American, but I do want to say that this is where I'm located. But I recognize that in the African diaspora more broadly, whether you be in the UK or whatever, much of the same things that we'll talk about today apply to or of concern in those contexts as well. But I want us to think about this, right? There was in 1852, excuse me, mind you, this would have been about 10 or so years before the Civil War. You had somewhat of a civil war going on within the abolitionist movement, right? In 1852, there were a number of abolitionists who got together in Salem, Ohio, to, they were there to advance the cause. And what you found, I'll be brief with this, is that there was this budding contention between two trains of thought, right? You had one school of thought that followed the William Lloyd Garrison model of how to approach abolition. And William Lloyd Garrison was a famous preacher and abolitionist who believed in more so of a nonviolent approach to abolitionism, to put it mildly, right? But Frederick Douglass here, who is actually my favorite of all American figures, he's just my favorite thinker, particularly in American history. By 1852, Frederick Douglass was feeling some kind of way about this passive, what he perceived to be a passive, nonviolent approach, because in 1850 you had the passage of the Fugitive Slave Act, which allowed for enslaved persons who escaped, or formerly enslaved persons who escaped to the North, to be captured and taken back down to the South. Frederick Douglass thought that this was a major travesty and setback in the abolitionist movement, and so he began to entertain the idea that maybe we might need to up the ante a little bit. What I'm saying? We might need to ante up. I'm a hip hop head, so sometimes I use hip hop references. Like MOP. We might need to ante up a little bit. Maybe we need to take it to the streets. That's kind of what Frederick Douglass was on. And so as he was presenting at this abolitionist conference in 1852, he kind of espoused some of those views. Now, there was another famous abolitionist in the crowd that day by the name of Sojourner Truth. And for anybody who doesn't know, Sojourner Truth was truly about that life when it came to abolitionism. I mean, she was really out there in the trenches, putting herself in some very precarious situations to preach the gospel of abolition, if you will. She was no joke. But nevertheless, she disagreed with Frederick, and believed that his new position was essentially Xing God out of the picture, not really relying on God, but rather taking matters into our own hands. And so mid-presentation, as Frederick Douglass is expressing his view about the possibility that violence might be necessary to free enslaved persons in the South and other regions, Sojourner Truth interrupts him. Mid-presentation, it says, well, Frederick, is God dead? Is God dead? It's a profound question. It's a profound question. Is it the case that this God that we believe in, he is deaf to our concerns, that he's non-existent, as a matter of fact, and therefore unable to aid us in this precarious situation, right? In other words, God is the primary and really sole resource by which we can achieve freedom for our persons in the South, right? And if we relinquish that tie to God and his ways and his plans and his person, then we've given up, essentially. We've got no other resource by which to secure freedom. Is God dead? Now, Frederick Douglass, taken aback, he was like, well, nah, I don't believe that's the case, but she kind of chin checked him a little bit, but definitely made a statement. As a matter of fact, as I understand it, I think it's on Sojourner Truth's tombstone. It actually reads, "Is God dead?" Now, unfortunately, even though both of these figures would affirm that God is indeed not dead, we have come to a place in African American history where many people are beginning to lose trust that is true. Okay, I won't go through all the data here, but there was a study done by the Pew Research Center that showed that out of the 4 scenarios by which they believe things will play out in the next 50 or so years, in 3 out of those 4, Christianity will reach to the point where you have fewer than 50% of Americans affirming Christianity within the next 50 or so years. One actually, one of the outcomes, they actually thought that it may be even 30 years. That might be the case. Where you would have a minority of persons here in America who at least profess Christianity. Right? That's a pretty jarring stat. Right? Now we know that not everybody who says they're a Christian indeed is a Christian. Obviously, that's not the case. But to have it to where Christianity is a minority perspective has great implications for how things play out here in the United States. Now, let me be clear, because sometimes I can't see everybody's face, and I know we're online. I am in no way, shape, or form saying that America is a Christian nation. We can get into this in the Q&A. I don't believe that America has ever been a Christian nation. If anything, it may have been a nation where there were a lot of Christian ideals and Christians present. We can talk further about that. But nevertheless, it is profound that we're reaching a place where Christianity is just out of favor. That has very great implications. To take it even further, all right, we're in a place now in the African-American context, kind of bringing home, where approximately one out of five African-Americans would identify as what statisticians refer to as the nones, N-O-N-E-S, okay, the nones. So the nones would be people who don't subscribe to any belief system in particular, and a subset of those would be like atheists and agnostics, people who just don't believe in God or are unsure. But nevertheless, 1 out of 5 African-Americans walking around today would subscribe to, would be in this category of just the nones, of not belonging to any religion in particular. So it's increasingly the case that whereas in the African-American context, we tend to take it for granted that, we're the kind of people that go to church. For many people, that's no longer the case, for at least 1 out of 5. I said all that to say, there is a responsibility that we have on our hands, right? When we think about what's going on around us, and when we think about the Great Commission, we have a responsibility on our hands to preach the gospel, right? This is Matthew chapter 28, verse 19, okay? We're supposed to be making disciples of all nations. Now, I won't be too long with this, but I just want us to think about, when you think about what we're charged to do, that passage doesn't say go and make converts, right? It says go and make disciples. Very different word, all right? The word disciple there, to a first century Jew, they would have understood it as the kind of person who has submitted themselves to the lifestyle and teachings of the rabbi, in this case, Jesus Christ, and by extension, the Holy Spirit. Those are the kind of people that we're trying to bring about, right? It says to all nations, right? Ethnos. My Hebrew Israelite friends would take issue with that. I'm saying, they would say, no, it's not for all nations. It's supposed to be for the Israelites. Well, but Jesus seemed to be convinced otherwise, right? Salvation was to be taken to all the nations. Now, here's the thing. I want you to think about this, right? And then we'll get into the meat of where we're trying to go. You can't make disciples of all nations without engaging the deceptions that have ensnared those nations. Okay? You can't make disciples of all nations without engaging the deceptions that have ensnared those nations. All people groups have common ideas amongst them, some of them good, some of them not so good. Like, we're all born into a context where we just have certain ideas that are floating around, you know what I mean? And we just kind of take them for granted, that they're true, that they're right. But given the fact that we know, going back to Genesis chapter 3, that mankind has a sin problem, we should always be on alert that some of the ideas that are common in any given ethnic or national context, any people group, some of those ideas are a reflection of the depravity of man. And so we should be ready to engage those things, right? Now, one of the ideas here in the African-American context, right, that we're wrestling with, again, I'm going to bring it back to human value. People have different perspectives on how we ought to go about attaining human value. What does it mean to have value? The Hebrew Israelite would tell you that you're not Black, you're a Hebrew. And that's the basis of where you need to build your self-esteem, right? But then the more science, somebody from the more science symbol say, well, no, you're not Black, you're not Hebrew, you're a Moor. And then the Kemeticist says, no, you're not Black, you're not Hebrew, you're not a Moor. You come from kings and queens and pharaohs, from Egypt and so on and so forth. Everybody vying for trying to answer this question of significance and value, right? So what we're going to do, we're going to engage this question and get to the bottom of where all value comes from. And my argument is going to be that it comes from God when it comes to human value. All right, are y'all with me so far? Everybody good? Okay, I see some finger snaps. Now, granted, I only see like 4 people on my screen, so there might just be 4 finger snaps out of the whole lot of you, but we're gonna keep it rolling, right? Okay. Let's see if we can hear. So let's talk here for a second. All right. Now, I want to be clear. I want to lay out my methodology to you because it'll make it easier as we go along to understand where we are and where we're going. Okay. So for me, I kind of take like a building block approach. We're going to lay some groundwork with some building blocks, some key concepts. All right. And then we put them together, the whole picture will make more sense of what it is that we're doing here. Okay. So, don't feel like you're lost in the middle, because, just like a story, you typically don't stop at the middle. You got to get to the end in order for it all to kind of make sense. All right. So let's start with this first key concept. Let's talk about worldviews. Okay. Let's talk about worldviews. What is a worldview? Well, it's kind of like how it sounds. It's the lens through which you see the world, or how you see the world. All right. One analogy I like to use is that a worldview is like a puzzle. Okay. A worldview is like a puzzle where each of those pieces represents something that you believe to be true or real in the world, like what reality is actually like. Okay. And when you put all of those pieces together, that's your big picture of reality. That's your worldview. Okay. So, what we're going to be advocating for is a Christian worldview, a biblical worldview, a worldview where each of those pieces of the puzzle is in some sense aligned with what the Bible teaches. And our argument is going to be that the biblical worldview provides a better foundation for the big questions that we tend to have, more so than the atheistic worldview and the Kemetic worldview. Okay. So when you think about big questions, it tends to be things like, does God exist? It's ultimate reality question. Who am I? These are questions that people are asking. Where do I come from? Do I matter? That deals with personal value. Does anything matter? Right? That deals with meaning. Why am I here? How should I live? Morality. How do I know what's true? Right? All of these things are kind of like what you might call existential questions that people have. And the reality is, every worldview is not equipped to answer these questions well. As a matter of fact, when you're engaging other people, all right, one of the ways of doing evangelism or apologetics is to show how their answers to one or more of these questions doesn't fit well, like kind of, again, using the puzzle piece analogy, the pieces don't fit together well, right? So if your response, if you're talking with somebody and their way of answering the God question, whether God exists or not, doesn't fit well with how they have to answer these other questions, then that's a red flag that there's something wrong with that worldview, right? In the Christian worldview, we're going to argue that all the pieces fit together well. They're able to answer each question, and the answers mesh well together. With atheism and Kemeticism, I would suggest to you that that's not the case, as we'll see here soon. Okay. Lastly, I'll say this about worldviews. Again, two main tests we're going to be looking for is livability and credibility. I'll start with credibility. With the big questions, right? We want to be able to have a worldview that answers these questions well. That's what you want to be able to do. You want to have a worldview that answers questions well. And secondly, if you have a worldview that is credible, then it should be livable, right? If you find yourself in a situation where your beliefs about reality, you can't actually live them out, then that's an indicator that there's something wrong with your worldview, right? So here's a perfect example. If I believe I can fly, if I think that I have the power to fly, and I jump out of a plane, I'm going to find out real quick that my beliefs do not align with reality. It's not livable, right? And so we're going to argue that when it comes to atheism and Kemeticism, ultimately you can't live the way that they answer these big questions would indicate that you would have to live. It doesn't line up with how life actually works. All right, are we good? All right, cool. So livability and credibility. All right. Okay. So I kind of spoke on this already. I'll just kind of breeze past, but not all worldviews are created equal. We're going to demonstrate how the Christian worldview is more able to address moral questions than these other worldviews. That's kind of what we're dealing with there. I'll just kind of skip that. All right. So again, and I'll be quick with this. One of the ways that you can show that somebody else's worldview is inadequate, that it doesn't add up, is if you can take something that's obviously true, right? Or excuse me, if what they believe leads to something that's obviously false. That's what I should have said, right? If what they believe leads to a conclusion that's obviously absurd, to where the intellectual price tag is too high, or you might say the moral price tag is too high, then that's an indicator that there's something wrong with the worldview, right? One of the things I like to say is this, and I'm trying to give like some little tidbits along the way when it comes to from an evangelism standpoint. When I'm going back and forth with somebody, right? If I make a claim against that person's worldview, that's one thing. They can go back and forth with me, right? People are ready to do that all day. But if I can show that person how their worldview is at war with itself, now they got a whole different problem, right? You can go back and forth with me all day, but my goal is to kind of put a little stone in your shoe to illustrate how your worldview is actually at war with itself. So you got to figure that out before you even try to come at Christianity, right? I want to show you that the intellectual or maybe the moral price tag is too high in order for any rational person to receive it. Another analogy that I tend to use is I have what's called like the test drive technique, right? Where in a conversation, I might gain information on what somebody else believes and then apply it to real situations. Let's say, okay, well, if what you're saying is true, then in this particular situation over here, how would your perspective on morality add up? Right. And so I'm gonna jump in the car with you. You're an atheist. All right, cool. Let's jump in the car and drive this car around and see how this works. And then what happens is inevitably I know that the car is going to crash. You know what I'm saying? And I want them to see that. I want them to see how their own worldview is at war with itself. Right. And if you can do that, then it makes your job a lot easier, because you're not just, going back and forth. You're helping the person to see that there's a red flag that they need to attend to. All right. Okay. Now, the area that we're talking about today, where we're going to illustrate how these worldviews have a red flag, how there's a clashing between the pieces, those puzzle pieces. We're going to talk about objective human value. Okay. Objective human value. Now, first of all, what do I mean by human value? All right. Now, we're using some philosophical language here. Okay. If you pick up a book on philosophy, then, they're going to use words in a certain way. It's just like, let's say if I come home and I had a hard day at work and I say to my wife, like, man, I feel kind of depressed. I mean it in a certain sense, right? Kind of like a general, I feel sad or something like that. If you go to a therapist or a psychiatrist and they tell you that you're depressed, they mean it in a different way. They mean it in a more clinical sense, right? Every field has its own jargon. Likewise, we're going to be covering a number of different pieces of jargon here that have specific meanings according to the field of moral philosophy. Okay. Actually, I feel I need to mention this real quick, and I apologize for this quick aside. As you might tell, I'm slightly ADD, so I can get distracted quite easily. But let me just share this with you right quick. Philosophy is not a cuss word, all right? I know, like when you think about philosophy, a lot of us, we come up with the basic subject matter in school, history, math, science, whatever. Philosophy is like, ooh, that's that stuff like weird people who drink lots of coffee, get into. You know what I mean? All philosophy is just the idea of thinking about something really hard. That's really all it is. There's a whole field of Christian philosophy, meaning Christians who take the biblical worldview and apply the truths of Christ and his teachings to philosophical questions to illustrate how it is that God's word aligns with the truth so people can understand it more readily. So that's what we're engaged in here. All right, that being said, objective human value, all right? We're talking about that attribute. We're talking about human value, that attribute that obligates us to regard somebody as having a certain degree of dignity and informs what it means to treat them right according to that dignity. Okay, that's what we're talking about when we say human value. All right. That attribute that obligates us to regard someone as having a certain degree of dignity and informs what it means to treat them right according to that dignity. All right. So let's say that I'm somewhere. I don't even, I'm not a shoe guy, so I don't know what like the hottest shoes are right now. But like let's say the newest J's, whatever it is. Yo, you know what it is, Kevin? I thought you were saying something. All right. Yeah, I'm gonna say the newest J's, whatever the J5s or whatever they are right now, 11s, whatever it is, right? So if I walk in, I got like the newest J's on, you're like, all right, cool. Like, you got some fashion sense out here, right? Now, if you're driving down the street and you see your neighbor cutting the grass in his new J's, it's like, well, hold up. You clearly don't know the value of these J's. Like you don't realize the value of the shoes that you're wearing, right? So, because if we understand the value of something, we treat it accordingly, right? So, likewise, in the same way that cutting the grass in like $20 shoes, makes a lot more sense than cutting the grass in your new J's, when it comes to human value, there are right and wrong answers. There's right and wrong ways to appreciate and then act upon the human value that we all have. Okay, we understand human value. There's a right and wrong way to treat people because humans have value, right? So when you think about the moral questions, all moral questions really boil down to human value. I mean, in terms of, at least in terms of how we treat one another, right? If humans don't have value, then it really doesn't matter how you treat folk, right? So when it comes to moral questions, at least between persons, human persons, human value is the hinge upon which moral questions turn. Okay, moral questions presuppose that humans have value. Okay, all right. So what about this notion of being objective? All right, all right. I want you to think about this right quick. All right, what does it mean to be for something to be subjective? Let's start there. All right, now let's say that there's an argument. Somebody's arguing between whether vanilla ice cream is better than chocolate ice cream, right? There's an argument going on. It's silly, right? Because it's subjective. It's up to the taste of the person, right? There's no right answer as to whether or not chocolate ice cream is better than vanilla or vanilla is better than chocolate, right? There's no right answer to that. Okay, it's all about the taste of that person. That's what it means for something to be subjective. It's based upon the perspective of the person or opinions of a person. Okay, that's subjective. If somebody comes into KB, you're a chaplain. If somebody comes into your office and says, "Man, me and my wife, we got into it, man, because she said that chocolate ice cream is better than vanilla, and I'm not feeling it. Like we about to get a divorce." Your next move would probably be to say, before you get that divorce, you probably need a psychological exam because there's something really wrong with you if you're willing to divorce somebody over something subjective like that. There's no right answer on when it comes to subjective, something that's subjective. Now we have to ask the question: is human value subjective? I would argue that it's not. I would argue that it's not. I would argue that it's not something that's just up to the taste of a person. I think that our deepest intuitions tell us that human value is not like, vanilla over chocolate. It's not just something as simple as what somebody's opinion is. There's a more firm ground for our sense that humans have value. Okay. And we can describe it, when you think about like the Black Lives Matter movement, right? Whether we agree, I'm not talking about the organization, but just the statement, Black Lives Matter, right? People weren't saying that, in my opinion, Black Lives Matter, and I hope you agree, or Black Lives Matter to me, and would you mind agreeing with me on that? They weren't saying Black Lives Matter, I hope. They were saying Black Lives Matter. It's a fact, right? It's an objective fact that Black lives have value, that Black Lives Matter. That's the sense in which people typically understand human value, right? They understand it in the objective sense. In the same way that 2 + 2 = 4, human beings have value. Okay. So going back again, when we're talking about value throughout this conversation, we're not just talking about subjective value. We're talking about objective human value. Human beings have objective human value. And our argument is going to be that if there is no God, then that can't be the case. And we'll see that here in a second. Okay. I know we're moving along. One last thing, when it comes to this sense of objective value, all right. And again, in moral philosophy, that term value, we're talking about something that's either good or bad. That's when people throw that word value in there, it carries with it the sense that something's either good or bad, to what moral, in a sense, like moral value is what we're talking about here. If you can't establish a basis for moral value, then essentially you don't have a foundation from which to build a moral framework. All right. And so what we're going to be illustrating is that there's a crack in the foundation with respect to atheism, right? There's a crack in the foundation with respect to Kemeticism. And just like a house, if you have a crack in the foundation, you could have a crack in a window, the roof, whatever it may be. If you got a crack in the foundation, that's a whole different type of problem, right? Because you're going to continue to find issues throughout the entire house. And such is the case when it comes to atheism and Kemeticism, because there's a crack in the foundation with respect to how they answer the objective human value question. They're unable to build a solid moral framework that is of any use in reality. Okay. All right. So let's practice something real quick. All right. We're going to be utilizing a particular tool, right, in order to bring out this argument that we have. We're going to use a syllogism. all right? Or we're going to use, we'll just call that, it's a syllogism. So a syllogism typically has a couple different statements and then a conclusion, like statement one, statement two, and then a conclusion, all right? So that's going to be the tool that we utilize to help us to illustrate how it is the case that God is necessary for morality and how the Kemetic framework doesn't add up, okay? So I'm going to ask you guys this question. I'm going to bring a question to the table that I recognize is controversial. I recognize it might ruffle some feathers. This is a question that has been in our community since like the beginning of time. And depending on where you are, this question can make or break a cookout, all right? It can cause a family feud, all right? That question is, who made the potato salad? That right there, depending on how you answer that question, when you pull up to the cookout and you ask that question, depending on the answer, that can be the difference between a great afternoon and not so great afternoon. Who made the greens? We could do that, right? Who made the potato salad, right? All right. Let's have some fun with this. All right. Here we go. I got to move my gallery here so I can see. If Aunt Sis did not make the potato salad, then the potato salad is suspect. That's premise one. That's statement one. Statement two, the potato salad is not suspect. Therefore, fill in the blank, who made the potato salad? Let me get somebody to chime in. You can unmute yourself. Who do we think made the potato salad?
Aunt Sis.
Aunt Sis, right? Okay, there we go. Real easy to figure out. So this is a syllogism. All right, this is an argument. This is an argument in syllogism form. You got two statements, which you call a premise, right? And then we have the conclusion right there in statement number three. So premise one, if Aunt Sis did not make the potato salad, then the potato salad is suspect. But thankfully, premise two, the potato salad is not suspect. Therefore, our conclusion, we conclude that Aunt Sis must have made that potato salad. Okay. If you can understand how this argument here works, then it's going to be the same format of the argument that's going to help us to understand objective human value. It's the same form. Okay. So again, we got premise one, premise two, and then the conclusion. So here is, there we go. So here's going to be our argument for the evening. Same format. If you can understand the previous statement about Aunt Sis, the previous argument about Aunt Sis, this is the same format. If God does not exist, premise one, if God does not exist, then objective human value does not exist. Premise two, objective human value does exist. We get to the conclusion, statement three there, therefore God exists. Okay. This is our argument for the evening. Let me show it again on the screen, make it a little bigger. If God does not exist, premise one, if God does not exist, then objective human value does not exist. Premise two, objective human value does exist. And then we got the conclusion there, three, therefore God exists. Okay. This is what you call it, just kind of a basic syllogism. Now, here's how you analyze whether something is either a good argument or a bad one. Okay. You want to be looking for at least two main things. Okay. One, you want to make sure that each of those premises, premise one and premise two, is more likely to be the case than the opposite, right? The interesting thing about an argument in this format is that it's not dependent upon certainty. We don't have to convince the other person that each of these premises is certainly the case. Actually, in philosophy, commonly, all we need to demonstrate is that each premise is more likely than its negation, or is more likely than not. All right. So that's number one. As you're evaluating arguments, you want to see that each premise is more likely the case than not. Okay. Secondly, you want to make sure that the conclusion follows from the premises, right? There's, given one and given two, then three is like the output, if you will, of the first two premises. That's what you're looking for. Okay. And so again, I'll read it again. And what we're going to do is we're going to go through each premise, because again, we want to be able to show that these premises are more likely to be the case than not. So for each of these premises, we're going to be given reasons as to why we take them to be true. All right. So I'll read it one more time and then we'll get into each premise. Number one, if God does not exist, then objective human value does not exist. Number two, objective human value does exist. Therefore, God exists. This is an argument. This is one of those things you can kind of just keep tucked in your back pocket and ready to pull out in the conversation if need be. All right. And in doing so, we want to be able to defend each premise. So that's what we're going to do now. Okay. I've been going for a while. Like, did you want me to stop midway for questions, or do you want to just keep rolling forward, Kevin?
It's really up to you, but I think this would be a good point to see if anyone has a question. There's not one in the chat. So
yeah, before we get to the actual argument, that might be good for us to hop in there. Anybody have any questions before we get started, or are we all clear? Again, there's no bad questions. I can't really see the chat, so just let me know, KB, if you see anything.
Yes, sir. Shanae, can you see them when they raise their hand, Adam?
Oh, it just tells me that somebody raised a hand. I'm not able to select it. I don't think.
Go ahead, Shanae.
Just a real quick, but not really a question, but a clarification. Could you define human value again? You said the attribute that obligates us to assign someone with dignity, and how we treat someone according to that dignity we assign them. Is that right?
Well, I would take out the words that we assign them. Okay.
Okay.
Because I would argue that the human value is not something that we assign. Because if we assign it, then that would make it subjective. Subjective meaning that it is based upon somebody's opinion or stance on the thing. Objective would be to say that something is true or something is real or true, regardless of what anybody thinks about it. No matter what anybody thinks about it, 2 + 2 is 4. You can argue that all day, but in basic math, that's what it is. That's objective. Our opinions or our stance on it doesn't really matter. Subjective is, what we assign, like, based upon what we think or what we, what our disposition is on it. That would be something that we assign. So I would just, really everything that you said minus the we assign part. Okay. Let me go back to I can just read it.
Thanks.
How I wrote it. That attribute that obligates us to regard someone as having a certain degree of dignity and informs what it means to treat them right according to that dignity. Does that help? Okay, cool. I see another hand. I can't see the name, but I do see another hand. The gentleman in the orange. Excuse me.
Yes, sir. I wanted to ask that human value, would that be considered something that overall that humans are born with, those laws that are written on our heart, that even though we didn't come up under the commandments of God or like Israel, but it's one of those common things that we all have. It's simply something that we know inwardly. So that's an objective fact that we have, that all human life has value.
Got you. So what we're going to do is, as we go through the argument, we're going to paint a couple of different pictures. In the Christian picture, it is the case that human beings have value, right? It's innate. It's something that we have, that it's been conferred or given to us. Okay. And I'm going to argue that ultimately the value that we have is grounded in God. However, I think that as we'll see in a minute, if you take God out of the picture, then you lose that foundation, and you end up with a picture where human beings don't have value other than that which we just kind of subjectively assign to folks. So that I think will kind of like play itself in the argument, and then maybe we can revisit your question to make sure we've answered it adequately. Okay.
Adam, one question from the chat, and then we'll continue on. A. Mason asks, will these arguments apply to Hebrew Israelites as well?
So actually, at the end of this presentation, I have another QR code because let me backtrack. So we're going to be covering atheism and Kemeticism, but I do think that there's a nuance to the moral argument that can be applied to Hebrew Israelism. And at the end of this presentation, there's going to be another QR code that takes you to one of my YouTube videos where I break all that down. I deal with Hebrew Israelism as well as Islam, and show how both of those systems both have flaws such that they cannot build a solid moral framework. I should say this. One of the things I want to be careful in saying is that even though it's very common for apologists to use the phrase "the moral argument," actually, there's a family of moral arguments. there are different variations of the moral argument. As a matter of fact, the one that you have on your screen is one variation of within the family of moral arguments. There's all kinds of moral arguments. I chose this format because I think that when it comes to human value, particularly within the African American context, it puts us in touch with the stronger points of the moral argument a little more quickly than some of the other versions. So, this the human value argument is one version of the moral argument. Other versions of which I think can be applied to, again, we'll see it here in a minute, Kemeticism, but then also Hebrew Israelism and so forth. But yeah, that QR code will be available towards the end.
That was it, sir. You're good.
Okay, cool. So, one last thing I want to say is that, when it comes to different genres of study, okay, they each have their own type of evidence that matters in that field. In different fields of study, there are types of evidence that matter in that field. When you think about chemistry, if you can put together two substances and they react in a certain way, and then you can replicate that reaction over and over again through some sort of testing or whatever, that's a piece of data that allows you to make certain claims about how these two things interact, right? There's some sort of physical chemical reaction, and it gives you some observations to go on, all right? Some scientific data. When it comes to the field of history, it's not about chemicals interacting with each other, is it? A piece of data might be a skull that an archaeologist found. Maybe if somebody discovered an alternative version of the Declaration of Independence, that was actually signed by Thomas Jefferson. That would be an interesting historical find, right? There's a piece of data, or a piece of evidence, I should say, that would matter in the field of history. When it comes to philosophy, the kinds of evidence that really matter are arguments. When you have an argument like this one, then it's not just an opinion anymore, right? You have a piece of evidence that gives you reason to stand firm in a particular position. In this particular case, that God exists, right? This argument is a piece of evidence, right? When we're talking about philosophy or critical thinking, that gives us reason to stand firm in our conclusion, right? So that's what we're doing here. So it's not just about opinions. This is how we move the needle in conversation, by making good arguments, okay? All right. So when it comes to the first premise, remember, again, we're going to walk through each premise 1 and 2, and give reasons as to why they're more likely true than not, right? And then that gives us firm ground to then stand on our conclusion, okay, philosophically. All right, so premise 1, if God does not exist, then objective human value does not exist. If God does not exist, then objective human value does not exist. Now, why should we believe that this premise is the case? All right, we're going to give several reasons. All right, I'm not going to go through all of them that we could give, but just enough so we can kind of get a taste for how we would defend this premise. All right. So first of all, let's talk about Christianity for a second. All right, let's paint the Christian picture. Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God, right? Can't get any more clear than that than what the foundation is. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, right? So Christianity, when we're given an account of how the reality actually is, our starting point is going to be God. You have an all-powerful God, and there's something particular about this guy. He's not just like a random Zeus type of guy, right? The Bible gives us other things that we can know about him. We can go to 1 John 1:5. Okay, when we're trying to understand what kind of God we're dealing with here, 1 John 1:5 says, "Now this is the message we have heard from him and declared to you. God is light, and there's no darkness in him." It says God is light. Now, it doesn't just say that God has light. Okay, it says that God is light. Okay, so there's something going on here. Now, in terms of imagery, the author here is pulling on this idea of light to mean something like goodness, moral goodness, glory, truth, and so forth, righteousness. That's what he's using the word light to depict. All right. And he's saying that God doesn't just have these things. God is light. Okay. So Genesis 1:1, in the beginning, God, if we want to know a little bit more about what this God is like, well, one of the attributes is that he is light. He is goodness. He is glory. He is truth. Likely. I mean, in addition, John chapter 4, verse 8 says, "Whoever does not love God does not know God." Why? Because God is love. Okay. God is not merely loving, God is love. Okay. So now remember what we're doing, we're putting some puzzle pieces in place. In terms of how we answer the God question, Christians believe that there is a God, and he's not just any God. There are certain things that are true about him. One of the things that is true about him is not just that God is good in the sense that he is like well behaved, that he follows the rules. No, God is goodness itself, right? That's who God is. God is light. He is love, right? So when it comes to the foundation of all reality, we serve a God who himself is goodness and is the moral standard, all right? Now, interestingly enough, it also says here that every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows, right? That's James chapter 1, verse 17. Every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of heavenly lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. Now, God himself, who's perfectly good, he's the very essence of what it means to be good. He's also unchanging. So if you have an unchanging essence of good being, aka God, at the foundation of your morality, human value, objective human value, you're starting off on a pretty good foot. Further, we can say, when you look at Genesis chapter 1, verse 26 and 27, I won't read all that, but that's where it gets into how God created us in his image and in his likeness. So, in terms of where we come from this good, unchangingly good God, right? And then he actually says that we're good. He looks at everything that he created and sits back and says, it's all good. And so when it comes to where we get our value, human value, okay, where does that human value come from a biblical perspective? It comes from a being, God, Yahweh, who himself is perfectly and unchangingly good. That's the foundation of objective human value from a Christian perspective. That's a great starting point. Now, unfortunately, what happens if you take God out of the picture? All right. What happens if you take God out of the picture? Now, interestingly enough, we'll answer that question there in a second. But before we do, I just want to say this. These philosophical ideas are not just kind of like abstract, gobbledygook, whatever, that have no meaning. Okay. These philosophical ideas are intertwined with our history and our human experience, right? Perfect example. Let me show you something right quick. Let's get a little Black history in here. I'll be real quick with it. This is my guy, Martin R. Delaney. He wrote a book. He was a contemporary, I should say, of Frederick Douglass, one of his compadres, who worked on the North Star with him and so forth, which was the abolitionist publication. Oh, by the way, the North Star, for people who don't know, was actually published out of the basement of an AME church. So for all the Christianity is white man's religion people out there, just, holler that right quick. Anyway, Martin Delaney, abolitionist, colleague of Frederick Douglass, he actually served in the Civil War. He's about that life. He talked it and he backed it up with some fighting as well. He wrote a book called The Condition, Elevation, Immigration, and Destiny of the Colored People of the United States. He's also a man of my own heart. He was a wordy kind of guy. It's kind of guy that, yeah, just like me. And in that work, he's talking about what is it going to take for African Americans, having secured their freedom, to build a community that can stand under the weight of oppression and everything that they need to do at the time. And if you look at chapter 3 of his book, he starts talking about God. He says this. He says, God's means are fixed laws of nature, part of his own being, and as immutable and as unchangeable as himself. Nothing can be accomplished but through the medium of and conformable to these laws. They are 3, these laws. And like God himself, represented in the 3 persons of the Godhead, the spiritual, the moral, and physical laws, right? Now I can go even further, but I just wanted to cite this as saying that here is an abolitionist, right? One of our main freedom fighters of the time, etching out what is it going to take in order for us to survive as a people. And he's saying that at the foundation, there are certain things that we got to line up with. One of those things being the immutable, unchangeable moral nature of God. God has to be the foundation, right? Another guy, shout out to my guy, Reverend Leonard Black, another abolitionist of the time, okay? He says it has, he's just making a statement about slavery. He says, in regard to African enslaved persons, has he not within him a spark of pure divinity, which when he is surrounded by high and ennobling influences is fanned into a light so bright as to lead us to respond to the glorious truth, man is indeed made in the image of God? Do you talk of selling a man? You might as well talk of selling immortality or sunshine, right? So this is another one of our freedom fighters who is taking the truths of Christianity and taking the very concepts that we're talking about here, God being the foundation and giver of value, and applying it to the abolitionist struggle, right? So these ideas, again, are not just kind of out here in the ether. I mean, these things really are intertwined with our own history. You know, we utilize these ideas as in order to leverage ourselves, if you will, out of our enslaved predicament. Okay. But what if God is out of the picture? All right. So we know, we've already established that God is a sound foundation for morality. But what if you take God out of the box, right? What are you left with? Okay. This is where we get into atheism. Atheism, classically defined, is the affirmation that there is no God or gods. That's classical atheism. Now people try to switch it up and try to like blend it with agnosticism. We could talk about that later. But just for the sake of defining terms, atheism, as classically defined, is the affirmation that there, or the stance that there is no God or gods. Okay. With respect to Black atheism, and I talk about this in my chapter in Urban Apologetics, I'm referring to that perspective within the context of the African American diaspora, or the African diaspora, wherein typically people couple the stance that there's no God or gods with concerns and objections to Christianity or religion that revolve around the African predicament. So that's kind of what I mean by Black atheism. So I want to kind of give that note there. All right. So here's the thing. Whereas if you have God in the beginning, you know, he's able to, he's the source of goodness. He is goodness himself, and he confers, goodness on us. That's not the story of atheism. If naturalism is true, meaning the only thing that exists is the natural world, that's like the most popular brand of atheism, if you will, then it looks more like this. This is the beginning. Nothingness. Right? Just you don't have God creating anything. All you have, miraculously, something came out of nothing. As a matter of fact, everything came from nothing. All right. Now, it should go without saying that nothingness can't have intentions. Okay. Whereas God intended good things for mankind, and he intended to confer on us objective value. He intended for us to treat one another a certain way according to that value. Nothingness can't have intentions. So already you're off to the wrong foot if you're an atheist, right? Because if you look in the rear view mirror of our origins, if atheism is true, then all we can look to is nothingness from which to find some sense of value. So already you're behind the 8 ball, right? In terms of how the natural world came about, if nothingness is your answer, everything came from nothing, then we already have a problem. And unfortunately for them, it gets worse. That's just the beginning of their woes. All right. I want us to think about this right quick. All right. If the origins of the universe can't tell us or give us any sense of where our value comes from, if there's nothing in our origins that can confer that value, the origin of the universe, is there anything about the universe itself that can grant human value? Does it arise from the universe itself, from the material world itself? Well, I want us to think about this, right? Let's say that you go into a lab, all right, and the scientist says, "Hey, sit over here in front of this X-ray machine, or just sit over here in this seat. We want to measure how much human value you have in your right pinky toe." Right? That's what we want to find out. We're going to take your weight. We're going to see how dense your bones are. We're going to measure you for like radiation, and I mean, whatever other thing they can measure you for. We're going to check your blood work, and then we're going to try to find out how much human value you have in your right pinky toe. Good luck with that. That's not going to work, right? The sciences, okay? The sciences can tell us about things about the universe as they are, okay? Scientists give us descriptive facts about how things are in the universe. They can tell us weight, density, viscosity, or maybe you can use the word fluidity. We could talk about maybe how strong a magnetic force is. There's all kinds of things that they can tell us descriptively about the universe and items in the universe. Human value is not a descriptive fact. Human value is prescriptive. In other words, human value doesn't just tell you how things are, it informs how things ought to be. Okay? It informs how things ought to be. Descriptive facts about the universe tell us how things are. Prescriptive things that we can encounter tell us how things ought to be. Your weight is a descriptive fact. All right. I lost 20 pounds or so last year. Feel really good about that. It describes, that I lost something, okay. I see your hand claps and fingers. Okay, cool. Thank you. But guess what? When I lost that weight, I didn't lose 20 pounds of human value. I'm still worth the same amount. I still have the same moral worth that I did before that I do now, as I do now. Okay. Why? Because human value is not a descriptive fact about us. It's a prescriptive fact about us. Now, here's the thing. There's nothing that the scientists can tell us about prescriptive facts. They can tell us about, what's going on descriptively, physical things. We know a lot about, the descriptive facts, but descriptive facts and prescriptive facts are very different. Okay. In the same way that we know it's silly, for somebody to say, hey, we're going to, find human value. See how much we're going to measure how much human value you have in your right pinky toe. We know that's silly because human value is not the kind of thing that you can discover by assessing descriptive facts about the universe. It's not physical. It's something other than physical. It's prescriptive. And by the way, this isn't just something that Christians came up because it sounds cute, right? This argument was actually advanced by this guy here, J.L. Mackie. He says that moral facts are qualities or relations of a very strange sort, utterly different from anything else in the universe. And he was making the same point that I did about the descriptive and prescriptive. J.L. Mackie was a stone cold atheist, straight up. So we're not just making up stuff that sounds good because we're Christians. We're also leveraging what atheists themselves often acknowledge in order to make our point. Okay, so that's number one. So again, we're combing through why are we stating that if God does not exist, then objective moral human value does not exist. All right, that's the first premise. And so far, we've given two reasons why we affirm that. One, because if we look at our origins from nothing, you can't find human value there. And if we look at the material world itself, the material world itself doesn't give rise to human value, or human value can't be found in it because it's a totally different type of fact. Okay. All right. So we're going to give another reason. What about evolution? Maybe we, somehow miraculously, the universe came into being for nothing, from nothing, by nothing, somehow created everything. And then down through, the annals of time, some kind of way, the earth was created somehow. And then, human beings, eventually emerge after, millions of years of evolution. By the way, there is no scientist on the planet Earth who can give you a definitive answer as to how evolution would have started in the first place. But that notwithstanding, let's just say that that's the case. Let's say that evolution is the best explanation as to how human beings have emerged. Could we look at the process of evolution and derive some sense of human value from that? Is that how is that where human value comes from? Well, what do we know about evolution? Survival of the fittest, right? If you look at the picture of evolution, it ain't too great. Okay, it's actually a pretty scary picture. Evolution is all about survival. Okay, it doesn't care about value, right? The process of evolution, by definition, evolution can't care about value. It's a blind, unguided process, right? So whereas people would say, well, maybe through natural selection and random mutation, conscious creatures emerged who eventually it was more advantageous for them to support one another than to destroy one another. Well, I hate to tell you, whereas that kind of herd morality, it sounds great, but our history doesn't sound like that. I'm saying we have a whole history of holocausts and schisms and isms and wars all throughout human history. That it's like a glaring neon sign that if evolution is playing out amongst us, is not to preserve us all, right? So even if it were true that there is some sort of herd morality that allows us to observe the humanity of some, certainly it doesn't account for the notion that all humans have value. Hitler certainly didn't think so. As a matter of fact, he invoked the theory of evolution as a reason as to why he needed to exterminate Jews and invalids and gypsies and so forth, right? If evolution is where we get our herd morality, then guess what? Slave masters were right. They were looking out for their own people and trying to secure resources and using other, I guess, theoretically, unempowered people to do so. That's what evolution gets you. You know where I got that idea from? Or at least you agree with me, at least in some sense. Your boy, Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin, who himself didn't necessarily endorse slavery, he said, given evolution, he said at some future period, not very distant as measured by centuries, the civilized races of man, I'll let you figure out who he's referring to there, will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. This is how Charles Darwin, the father of modern evolutionary theory, believed that it would play out amongst human beings. He thought the outworking of evolution was not that we would take care of each other and it would be like kind of a kumbaya moment, but that the civilized races, aka white folk, would exterminate people of color and replace them, right? So that's kind of what evolution gets you. It's about survival of the fittest. It's about survival of the fittest. One last thing I'll add in here too, and I'll just be real quick with it. But one thing we have to do is be careful of what's referred to as the is-ought fallacy. Okay, it's the is-ought fallacy. Just because something is the case doesn't mean that that's how it ought to be. Just because something is the case doesn't tell us how something ought to be. It is the case that some bees, the queens and women, like kill some of the men and the young women, or not men and women, but female bees or male bees. They kill each other. Some shark eat their young. That's how it is. But that I would hope that there's nobody on the call today who thinks eating their young is all right. Right? Evolution could have played out any number of ways. That could be us. If we ran back the tape of evolution and let it rock one more time, we might come out with very different morals and very different ways of behaving. We might be the kinds of beings that eat our young and think it's all right. But would that make it all right? Okay. So just because something is the case in terms of how it played out evolutionary, from an evolution standpoint, doesn't really answer the question of how things ought to be. And remember, when we're talking about human value, we're trying to give an account of that prescriptive fact, okay, that ought, right? Okay. So now we have another reason to believe that we're coming up short. You know what I mean? When it comes to atheism, it's not looking too good so far. If you're looking for human value, the origins is looking bad. We can't go there. When we're talking about, the material world itself is looking real sketchy. There's really no reason we should have real confidence when it comes to the evolutionary piece. It's looking kind of bad. It's kind of like, y'all can help me out. I don't know who sings the song, but it's that song where somebody's like, I searched all over, couldn't find nobody. I searched high and low, couldn't find nobody greater. In the same sense, like we're searching high and low for human value from an atheist standpoint. It's not working out, right? It's not working out. One last thought. There are some people, and this I'm not going to get too far into philosophical weeds here, but there are some people who believe that moral values, like objective human value, exists in the same sense that like numbers exist. Okay. In the same, what they refer to as like abstract. Okay. And so, and this is what you call moral Platonism for my philosophy nerds out there. They believe that moral values exist like in the same sense that like numbers and maybe like propositions and things of that nature exist. Right. Now, here's the thing. Again, on an atheist picture, if naturalism is true, which is the most popular form of atheism, and we look at the story of the universe, again, we started out with nothing. Some kind of way, from nothing came everything. We got planets, the planet Earth. And we boil down, we got animals and evolution taking place, and then all of a sudden, you got us, right? This is a long process, unguided just dominoes falling every which way, and then lucky us, we looked up and here we are. If all of those things are occurring by chance, it's extremely unlikely that a chance, unguided process from the Big Bang, if you will, to now would produce conscious beings like ourselves, who just happen after all this time to have the mental capacity to discover moral truths, mathematics, and so on and so forth. That would be like, if I took this cell phone right here, right? And if you ask me, how did you, get this, create this cell phone? How did this cell phone, how was it created? Right. I mean, I got all kind of apps on here. I can calculate, I can do all kind of stuff. It's like my second brain at this point. How did I get this right here? So if you ask me that question, and then I say, well, I went to this factory and there were some guys who they took all the pieces that are inside this thing, they threw it up in the air, and then it just formed into a cell phone, landed back in his hand and gave it to me. You would be right in thinking that I had probably been smoking some substances that day, because obviously that's irrational, right? Nobody believes that kind of complexity, particularly when it comes to manipulating information, the ability to do so, there's no good reason to think that those kind of things can just happen from chance, just on top of chance, just luck of the draw, right? So the idea that moral values are like an abstract, or just kind of like floating around there in the ether or something like that, and we just happen after all these billions of years to emerge with the capacity to discover them and understand them, it's like that would be more of a miracle than anything claimed in the Bible, to be honest with you. So just no good reason to think that's the case. We can come back to that if we need to. Okay, so now we've worked our way through the first premise. Okay, we've given at least 4 reasons to think that if God doesn't exist, remember we talked about that God who's himself, he's good, he confers upon us goodness, he's this unchanging, perfectly moral foundation upon which we build our moral framework, right? If you take him off the table, if God does not exist, then objective human value does not exist. Okay, and we've seen different reasons as to why. It's just a misguided and meaningless search, if you will, to look for objective human value if you take God off the table. Now, we're going to move to the second premise. Now, this will be a lot quicker than the first, which I'm sure many of you will be relieved at that. In the second premise, objective human value does exist. All right. Objective human value does exist. So if God doesn't exist, then objective human value doesn't exist. But premise 2, objective human value does exist. Okay. Now, what are some reasons that we can give for that? Like I said, this will be a lot quicker. All right. Now, when you're talking about moral philosophy, okay, one of the ways that moral philosophers make their case is to take a moral framework and test it out, similar to what I was talking about earlier with the race car analogy, the test drive analogy, rather. Okay, that's one of the ways that they try to arrive at right conclusions about morality. They test out different perspectives. And what they want to do is they want to say that, we have these moral intuitions, okay? And by intuitions, we don't mean just like a hunch or like a deep sense of something, but it's more like a deeply ingrained conviction that something is the case. That's what we mean by intuitions in this moral sense when it comes to moral philosophy, all right? We have moral intuitions, and any moral framework that somebody wants to have taken seriously has to account for our moral intuitions. If you have a moral framework that is way out of line, that just totally goes against the grain of common, deepest moral intuitions, then that's good reason to doubt that moral framework. Okay. So one of the ways that people will make their case when it comes to moral philosophy is to give scenarios that cause those moral intuitions to bubble to the surface, right? And if they can bubble, if we can kind of give rise to those moral intuitions in such a way to show that a moral framework is off, then that's evidence that there's something wrong with the moral framework that's being put forth, such as the case with atheism, and we'll see with Kemeticism. Okay. All right. So this whole second premise, what we're going to use in order to demonstrate that is more likely true than not, is we're going to tap into those moral intuitions. And we're going to use at least 2 scenarios to do so. Okay. So again, premise 2, objective human value does exist. How do we, why should we think that? Now I'm going to give you a scenario. All right, let's say that you're on a cruise ship, cruising along, you're having a good time, you're doing your shuffleboard thing with your Isaac and all that. I'm kind of dating myself there. But you're just having a good time, right? And then the captain comes on the loudspeaker, and he's like, "Look, y'all, I got some bad news. All right, we're pretty far from the shore, and we're running low on fuel. It's looking bad out here right now. Okay, but the good news is I've got a solution. What we can do is we can either throw 25 chairs overboard to lighten the load, and that'll get us to our destination, or we can throw 25 people overboard to lighten the load, so we can get to our destination. Now I'm going to leave the decision up to y'all. Captain out. Boom. And he's gone, right? Now, I think it should go without saying that, at first you go, yo, that's crazy. But then you look to your left, and old boy next to you starts chucking kids and grandmas into the water. You're like, yo, wait, whoa. You've missed something here. We were given a choice, and you made the wrong one, brother. Slow down. Why? Because obviously we know that people are of more value than chairs, right? Our deepest moral intuitions tell us that inanimate objects are not valuable in the sense that people are, objectively so, right? So that says to us, wait a minute, if you think that the guy who was chucking people overboard, grandma's gone, now you got to send the search boat out for and all that. If you think that guy was wrong, then you agree with premise 2. You agree that humans have objective value, because otherwise it doesn't really matter, right? Okay. Now, lest we think that this is some sort of like this kind of hypothetical, there's an unfortunate reality, right? During the transatlantic slave trade, and I think it was September 6, 1781, you had a British slave ship called the Zong set sail from West Africa to Jamaica, carrying 400 enslaved persons, right? And along the way, they indeed found themselves in a bad situation. The slave ship was off course, and they were losing water. They were running out of water. There wasn't enough water for the crew and their quote unquote cargo. Mind you, prior to taking off, the captain, I think it was Captain Collingwood. I think it was Captain Collingwood. James Gregson, the owner of the ship, insured his cargo, quote unquote, meaning these enslaved persons. So again, September 6, 1781, they set sail. They're off course. They've got water issues. They're not going to make it. And so in November 29th, 1781, Captain Collingwood made a fateful decision. He ordered his crew to throw some of the cargo overboard. And in doing so, the crew of the Zong threw 131 Africans overboard to their deaths. Right. This came to be known as the Zong Massacre. The Zong Massacre. And so when the Zong arrived in Jamaica, James Gregson, the one that was the owner of the ship, he filed to receive money, back for the cargo that he had insured. Initially, he won. I think it was later overturned. But nevertheless, those 131 Africans were gone. They went to a watery grave, right? Now, the Zong Massacre ended up being like the clarion call to abolitionists, of that time, like Alado Equiano, Granville Sharp, and others who looked at it and said, this is clearly wrong. This is obviously wrong. They should not have done that. They should not have thrown these Africans to their doom. That was wrong. As jarring as this is, if you agree with the abolitionists that the Zong Massacre was wrong and that they should not have thrown these people, to their doom, then that is to affirm our second premise, that objective human value does exist. The whole argument that the abolitionists were making on behalf of those who were slain in the Zong Massacre hinged upon the notion that there is indeed objective human value that was trampled upon by the crew of the Zong. Okay. But with that being the case, we've now established premise 2. We've used our deepest moral intuitions, which is much more than emotion. It's not just, if you feel bad about it. You have a deep conviction that this should not have been the case, establishing premise 2. So we've established premise one. If God does not exist, then objective human value does not exist. We've established premise two, objective human value does exist. And that leads us to our conclusion, therefore God exists. Okay. So that in a nutshell, again, this is just one of many of the versions of the moral argument. And we'll briefly get to, which will be much quicker, we'll briefly get to the Kemeticism argument. But I do want to camp out here for about 5 minutes or so to entertain questions just for clarity's sake before we go forward. Is that all right, Kevin?
Yes, sir. Absolutely. So Karen asked a while ago, she said, how would we explain this? You are on premise one then. How would we explain this to those who believe they were born gay, thinking about the human value argument?
Okay, I'll answer the question, and then if I don't hit the target of what you're asking, then feel free to like reframe it so I can understand better what the question is. But for one thing, just as a general tool of evangelism and so forth, wherever you can find common ground, then we should do so. And so in that case, I would agree. Yes, people who, I would not agree that they're born gay, at least not in the sense that they would say it. I think we're all born in sin, with a sin nature, and it could be that the way in which it plays out in your life has to do with your choices about gender and sexuality. But nevertheless, human value is not negated or enhanced, for that matter, by your lifestyle. You could be the sinniest of sinners, and you still have human value, right? And another way to put it is, I think we make a common mistake of assessing one's value based upon their behavior. Okay. And the biblical picture is, no, actually, just by virtue of being made in the image of God, that in and of itself grants value. You have value based upon that. Now, you may not behave and actually live it out that way, but that's ultimately what is resolved in the cross. Christ is reconciling us back to the Father to function in such a way that accords with who we were made and being made in the image of God, right? So, so I would just say that, the person who says they were born gay, we could have a conversation about that piece, but when it comes to human value, regardless of what sin somebody is involved in, it is still the case that they're made in the image of God, and that in and of itself, there's a baseline of value that they can either live up to or not. Does that make sense?
Bro, that was fire.
Okay.
That was the only question that I saw in the chat. So if you're cool with it,
okay,
we can open it up. Does anybody else have any questions real quick?
Could I ask a question, Kevin, on the mic, or do I have to? I was driving, so
I normally just let wait for the questions.
Is that Damon?
And then go. Yeah, that's Damon.
Yeah, that's
nah, Damon, you can't ask no questions, man. Nah, man.
You taking up your time. Tell him his is tomorrow. Go ahead, Damon.
Yeah, you got your time tomorrow, man.
Yeah. No, so no, this is really good. You're raising some things that I haven't thought of, at least in this way. But I guess the way my mind works is that I start thinking about possible pushback. So,
sure.
What if somebody were to push back and say, well, hey, I think you're framing it in a convenient way in order to establish your second premise. So what if they were to say these two things? Well, number one, I don't necessarily think that there's objective human value, but maybe value based on priority, right? And so they give you this example. So they said you framed it with a more obvious choice, like chairs or people.
Sure.
But what if it was, we've got to save, in order to save the ship from going down, we've got to choose between 25 people, and and let's just say half of those people, or let's say 30, half of these people are murderers, and the other half are just law-abiding citizens. That's not necessarily an objective human value standard. That's more of a standard of priority. Like, who do you think they're going to choose? Which 15 people? The law-abiding citizens, or the or the murderers? Case number two. It's not necessarily people in the chairs, but it's chimps in chairs. Do chimps have objective moral value? Or is this really more of a matter of priority of value, who we prioritize over the other based on our own subjective priority value type systems? So how would you kind of come back at that, if you get my point?
That's a great question. Yeah, for sure, for sure. So, I mean, so other apologists would probably take a different route. Like for me, I'm always looking for a common ground. And so actually I would affirm like the underlying idea behind the dilemma. Like the whole reason there's a dilemma there presupposes that value is objective. You see what I'm saying? Like it was, I'll use the first example between the killers, I think you said murderers, and then like law-abiding citizens, right? The
That's
idea,
correct.
right. So I would just say that at the end of the day, that doesn't undermine that either of those classes have value, whether we prioritize them or not. You see what I'm saying? In other words, to say that to compare two classes of people who have maybe, let's say that we assess them as having different value. I wouldn't say they do have different value, but let's just say that we treat them in some sort of hierarchical way is kind of like is disanalogous from the point that I'm trying to make. I'm saying, because I'm making the argument that if there's no, like between like no value and some value, you see what I'm saying? It's like two different arguments. Does that make sense? Let me try
It does, but again, I'm thinking how they might push back. So what if they say, well, hey, the chair has value too. I mean, it holds people up. It adds value to the decor of the home and all kinds of things. We obviously pay money for it. So it's clearly a case where one thing has more value than the other, and we just logically go with the thing that has more value to us based on priority. And so they would argue that we've created a sense of false dilemma, because it's not that one has value and the other doesn't. It's that we just esteem one to be more valuable than the other.
Oh, yeah. So
that's right.
Yeah, got you. So in that sense, I would say that there are different types of value, right? Now, this argument hinges on a particular type of value, which is moral value, right? If something has like moral worth, whereas a chair would have something like, functional worth, like it's functionally valuable. And so I would want to like clearly delineate between the types of value that we're dealing with. My argument would be to say that we have no moral worth, no moral value. So a chair, yeah, you're right. I mean, you could, I don't know, if you're down in Montgomery, you can hit somebody with it. You can, sit on it at the, at the cookout or whatever. I mean, it has functional worth. It can be used for something. I would argue, maybe this makes it more clear. I think that a utility-based value is different from the kind of value that human beings have, right? If human beings have a value when it comes to utility, then slavery is okay, because really all human beings are worth is whatever they can be used for. And I would argue that actually doesn't really add up with the kind of value that we mean when we say that human beings have value. I think that what we mean is that they have something more than like a utilitarian or utility-based value or functional-based value. There's a different type, meaning a moral value that we have. Now, obviously, when it comes to delineating between chairs and humans, maybe that's something that would have to be teased out. I think a tighter, a more nuanced discussion would have to be between like the killers and like the law-abiding people, and so my assessment there would be to say that it could very well be that in terms of how we, I guess I'll just say, navigate moral questions, that we do so in like somewhat of a hierarchical way, but that would not be to say that there's no value. That I don't think that would militate against the idea that we have that the human beings have value.
What would you say with the chimps and the chairs?
What's that?
What would you say with the chimps and the chairs? The chimps are not necessarily of functional value, I think if it came down to chimps and
Yeah.
chairs, I would save the chimps, not the chairs, but they don't have moral value to me nor functional value. What type of value do they
Well,
have? And why
actually,
would we
so
save them over the chairs?
this is actually a deep philosophical question, because I do think that animals have moral value. I don't think that they have moral value that's equal to human beings, but I do think that wrapped in our command to steward the earth, I mean, yeah, I do think that there's like a moral obligation that we do have to the animal kingdom, you know, and I do think that we can trample upon that or not. Like, if we're hunting tigers, or I'll just say with the chimps, if you were to throw the chimps overboard instead of the chairs, I think that actually would be in violation of what it is that we're called to do as being made in the image of God. So actually, I do think that animals have moral worth. I just wouldn't put it on par with, like, I wouldn't say a roach is equal, to a human being, but I also don't think that a chimpanzee would be equal with a chair. You see what I'm saying?
That's
So,
good. Okay.
so yeah.
All right.
Does
That's
that
good,
make
man.
sense, or?
No, yeah, you did good, man. I'm just always thinking from the opposite end.
And we should.
Because
We
yeah,
should. We definitely should.
Reminds me of that
Yep.
old Bill Cosby, the challenge, so. But
No, that's good. That's
yeah.
good. That's the way it's supposed to be. That's the way
Adam,
it's supposed
real
to be.
quick, there were two other questions, and then Tanisha, I see your hand is raised as well. So this kind of goes, I think, into Kemeticism. But the question is, what if one person believes in God but says not the God of the Bible and prays to their ancestors?
Yeah. So, one of the most just kind of rules of thumb when it comes to whether it be debate, or we'll just say critical thinking and dialogue. Maybe it didn't have to be, maybe debate is too strong of a word, but essentially whoever makes a claim is on them to defend that claim, right? And so if I'm putting forth the biblical perspective, and I'm saying, hey, here's why I think the biblical God provides a sound foundation for moral value, human value, they're like, nah, bump that. I think it's the ancestors. Okay, cool. Why do you think the ancestors provide a sound foundation? It's on them to demonstrate that. So notice, before I got into atheism, I painted a picture of how the biblical worldview works with respect to human value. They would need to do something like that in order to make their case about the ancestors. Now, I would argue that, and this this is interesting. So I would argue, let's say you're praying to the ancestor, right? Man, I'm trying not to go too far with this. I'm going to reference this, and then I'm going to point you to my chapter in Urban Apologetics. Okay. All right. Urban Apologetics, restoring Black dignity with the gospel, because some of what I say is going to kind of flow from what I said in here. Okay. Now, just as a little tidbit, this type of question is the reason why it's helpful to have at least a general grasp of different arguments for God's existence. Because sometimes what you find in engaging one question, it intersects with another argument for God's existence. And so you can find yourself starting in point A and being able to bring in another point for God's existence from point B to answer a question. So with this question, they want to say, what if that person believes that the ancestors, is where value comes from? Now, we could ask the question, where did that ancestor come from? Okay. So grandma came from great grandma, and great grandma came from great great grandma, and great great grandma came from great 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 grandma. And what's going to happen is you're going to have this infinite chain of great grandmas that is going to do one or two things. Either you have an infinite line of grandmas going all the way back to infinity, and in some kind of way arriving to the present, right? Or at some point there has to be a first ancestor, right? It's going to be one or the other, right? Now, what I would argue, and this gets into, if anybody's familiar with it, is the Kalam cosmological argument, and maybe the contingency argument. I would argue that an infinite chain of causes. So when you think about it, granddaddy caused great 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 granddaddy caused the next granddaddy, and the next granddaddy after that, blah, 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 blah. I'm going to say, those are all, each granddad or each grand ancestor, each ancestor is a cause for the one that follows after it. I would argue that an infinite chain of causes going back to infinity is what you might say, and I know it's a technical word, but it's metaphysically impossible In the same sense, just to illustrate what metaphysical impossible means, it would be like saying that there's a triangle with 4 sides. All right. No matter how you slice it, you can't have a triangle with 4 sides and 4 angles. Right. Definitionally, that's metaphysically impossible. If I say, look, I'll give you $1 million if you can go find me a triangle with 4 sides and four angles, you're not going to leave your house. You're not going to leave your chair because you know that's impossible. That's silly, right? In the same way, I would argue that an infinite chain of causes is impossible. So if that's true, then that means that there can't be an infinite chain of ancestors, okay, going back to infinity. There would have to be at some point a first ancestor. Mm-hmm. And so I'm going to argue that whoever they would have to refer to as the first ancestor, the best explanation for who that first ancestor is would be Yahweh, as opposed to anybody else they could bring up. And that's where we take discussion and say, well, why would I say that Yahweh is the best explanation for who that first ancestor would be? And then in a backdoor kind of way, now I'm going to bring them back to why the biblical God is going to be a better explanation than their ancestors. Sorry for the long answer there, but that's just how I would look at it.
No, it's thorough. There's one more question, but just out of respect for your time, I want to allow you to finish more of your presentation, and then I'll save it for the end Q&A period. Okay, cool. Yeah, and this will be a lot quicker. And I know that we've got like the after party and whatnot. So I got my double shot energy drink. You know what I mean? I'm ready to be lit during the after party. I'm with it. I'm here for it all. You know what I mean? At least for a little bit until my kids start crying. I got to put them to bed. But So, okay, cool. So we're going to keep going with the presentation, or? All right, cool. All right. Okay. So, again, so this is regarding atheism. If God does not exist, objective human value does not exist. Objective human value does exist. Therefore, God exists. Obviously, if God exists, then atheism is false, because that's literally what atheism means, classically speaking. All right. So human value on atheism, I would argue, falls apart like in the same way that this deck of cards does, right? You have no foundation for it, right? And so whatever claims you would want to make, Black Lives Matter makes no sense on atheism, so and when it comes to from an objective human value standpoint, all right? Okay. And this goes back to, remember I was saying before about the price tag being too high. If you have to affirm that, you're right, human beings don't have objective value, then I would argue that's a moral price tag that's too high to pay, and is evidence that there's probably something wrong with your worldview, right? That's a red flag that's come up, okay? So let's talk about Kemeticism real quick. All right, now again, just kind of backtracking real quick, and I know I'll be real quick with this, but again, what we're doing is when it comes to worldviews, there are just certain fundamental questions, all right, that your worldview should be able to answer. Right, you should be able to answer those questions rationally, but then also the answers to your questions should fit together, just like the puzzle we talked about before. But if you find these answers, these things that you believe to be the case, not fitting together in your worldview puzzle, then that's evidence that there's something wrong with your worldview. All right. And so what we're doing is we're taking the way that some worldviews answer some of these questions, and we're putting them together with some of these other puzzle pieces. And we're saying, hey, there's some friction here to identify where the pain points are in that worldview and put a stone in their shoe. So we're going to do the same thing when it comes to Kemeticism. Okay. And atheism, obviously, again, classically defined, is a belief that there is no God or gods. Okay. Kemeticism is going to be a little bit different. Now, I do want to say one of the unique, I would say unique, aspects of urban apologetics is that some of these worldviews that we're dealing with, they're actually kind of in like constant revision. They're relatively young, and they're being they're constantly evolving, right? And so what I try to do, particularly with Kemeticism, I try to give people information that puts you in the ballpark of that guy that you're going to meet at the barbershop. You know what I mean? All Kemetics aren't going to believe the same thing, but there are just general themes that you're more likely to encounter than not, when you're dealing with them. So that's kind of what we're addressing here. Same thing with Hebrew Israelism. There's like a billion different, camps and so on and so forth. But there are some points that, will put you in the ballpark, generally speaking, in terms of what they believe more so than other things. So that's what we're aiming for here. Okay. Now, Kemeticism, or sometimes you hear people say the Kemetic science or sciences, is a worldview which centers around ancient Egyptian heritage, thought, philosophy, and spirituality, generally speaking.
The term Kemet is understood to be the word that either refers to the black people or the black land in Egypt. But either way, that's it's taken to be what people from that region refer to themselves as. So therefore, people who subscribe to this worldview will refer to themselves as Kemetics. Okay, so again, we're talking about a worldview which, broadly speaking, centers around the ancient Egyptian heritage, thought, philosophy, and spirituality. Okay, now often you're going to run into two broad types of Kemetics. Okay, I think there's like, we might call them subgroups. Okay, one is what I refer to as the Kemetic non-spiritualist. Okay, the Kemetic non-spiritualist. So again, it's going to be the worldview that revolves around the heritage, thought, philosophy, and in some sense the spirituality of ancient Egypt, what they believe it to be, but not the supernatural aspects. And so these are going to be the people who would say that, well, the different so-called gods and goddesses of ancient Egypt, they weren't actually gods and goddesses, they were forces of nature. They were just talking about different aspects of nature and assigning, a deity to it because they honored the universe or something like that. But it wasn't actually what Kemetic might say is like spookism and all that kind of stuff that Christianity gets into. That's typically how they talk, right? And so they'll still draw from the heritage and thought and philosophy of Kemet, but not so much the supernatural aspect. So for anybody who follows the conscious community, this would be somebody like a Brother Reggie, or maybe to some extent like a Brother Polite, at least earlier on. That would be kind of like examples. Now, the other camp would be, or the other type, I should say, would be the Kemetic spiritualist. So these would be those who, again, hold to the Egyptian heritage, thought, philosophy, and spirituality of ancient Egypt, but they also include, in some sense or another, the supernatural aspects, okay, of what they think ancient Egyptians adhered to. So on the one hand, when the non-spiritualists, one way I like to put it is that typically it's kind of like a Kemet flavored atheism, when it comes to the Kemetic non-spiritualists. Okay, the Kemetic spiritualist is typically more so like a Kemetic flavored pantheism. Kemetic flavored pantheism. Okay, I think I got the wrong slide in here actually. Oh, yeah, sure do, but it's all right. So pantheism, whereas atheism is that there is no God or gods, pantheism is everything is God. Everything is divine. Pan means all, and then theos is where you have the God part. So pantheos, pantheism, everything is God. Okay. So typically, or often I should say, the Kemetic spiritualist is going to hold to something like that. And so for them, that's where they're going to draw their human value from. They're going to say everything is God, everything is divine. Therefore, since we're part of that everything, in some sense, we're divine. And that's where your value comes from. I think I lost one of my lights here, but it's all right. All right. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take a couple pieces of what they believe, a couple puzzle pieces, and then we're going to show how they clash in such a way that I would argue they don't give a firm foundation for morality in general and human value specifically. So number one, we want to bring out this idea of what they refer to as Ma'at. Okay, so that's going to be a goddess, or sometimes they'll say a principle, that represents order, justice, reciprocity, and so on. She's the personification of virtue. So when you think about Ma'at, that's order, which they would, which is for them is like saying goodness. I'm saying they kind of use the term order and goodness interchangeably. At least the ones that are well versed anyway. All right, so that's Ma'at. So when you think about, a lot of people will harp on like, oh yeah, I follow the 42 principles of Ma'at. It's like, and they kind of compare it to the 10 commandments and so forth. Well, what are they talking about? They're talking about this, quote unquote goddess that, there were these principles by which you would be evaluated, at death to see if you measured up or not, to this standard of goodness of Ma'at. All right. So the opposite of that is Isfet. Okay. So Isfet represents chaos. Okay. So you have Ma'at represents order, and wrapped up in that notion of order for them is goodness and virtue and all that kind of stuff. Isfet means chaos. Okay. And so it's like the opposite. It's injustice, imbalance, AKA evil. That's how they look at it. All right. So you've got Ma'at, and then you have Isfet on the one hand. These are two realities, all right, in the Egyptian worldview, excuse me, Kemetic worldview. All right. So that's puzzle piece number 2. All right. Puzzle piece number 3 we kind of spoke about it a little bit already, is this notion of what they refer to as the one. Okay. So again, for them, they would affirm that everything is God. Okay. Everything is a part of the one, or they might say the all. Okay. Some of them who are maybe like a little more philosophically inclined, or maybe read a little bit more, might say something like everything is an emanation or expression of the one. All right. But at the end of the day, they believe that ultimately the only thing that exists is the one. It's very interesting. I would encourage y'all, and I don't know if you have this included in your packet. I know you've given a packet, Kevin, to the students here. It'd be interesting for them to take a look at the debate that happened between Vince Bantu and Brother Jabari, who is a Kemetic priest. So I think I want to say it was like the very last question during the Q&A section. There was a guy, my homie from out here in VA, asked a question about actually I can't remember how it was worded, but Jabari starts kind of going on this thing about how there's really no difference between him and the podium, and there's no difference between him and like chairs and things of that nature and stuff like that, right? He just said it like real quick, and this is exactly what he was talking about. What he was saying is that really the ultimate reality is, at the end of the day, the only thing that actually exists is the one, and we are all expressions of or emanations of the one. Okay, but everything is God. There's one being and it's God. Okay, so we got Ma'at on the one hand, we have Isfet on the other, right? These are two realities, but everything exists within the one. Now, here's where we see that there's a problem with how these puzzle pieces fit together. Okay, so if everything exists within the one, all right, now let me pause for a second. Okay, from a Christian perspective, just so we can kind of paint a contrast, from a biblical perspective, again, we have a God who's the foundation, who himself is goodness, right? As the foundation for all things, for goodness itself. Okay, that's the guy that we're talking about. He's goodness. He's unchangeable, right? There's no shadow of turning with him. You know what I'm saying? There's all kinds of verses about his holiness. There's nothing evil within him. In him, there's no shadow of turning, and so forth, right? That's the kind of guy we're talking about. So that kind of God, who is unchangeably firm as a moral foundation, you can build on that. The problem is, if everything is part of the one, then order is part of the one, but then also chaos and evil is part of the one. So that means that the entity that occupies like that God spot in their worldview is in some sense morally tainted. Within that entity, there's evil, right? You can't just claim one without the other. On the one, you got Ma'at as part of the one, and Isfet is part of the one, order and chaos. So in contrast to a God who's unchangeably good, the one in the Kemetic worldview is, they would have to admit, is obviously, in some sense, partially evil. There's evil within him. So now we can ask the question that brings up a couple of different problems, right? Number one, that's a pretty shaky foundation to build a moral framework on. Like, to build a moral framework from a partially immoral entity is a less firm framework or foundation than the God of the Bible, who himself is morally perfect and unchangeably so. So already they're behind the eight ball, because their starting point for morality itself is partly immoral, right? So that's problem number one. All right, you have an imperfect being to build from. Now I'm gonna be super nerdy right quick. Shout out to if I have any philosophy nerds in the chat. This actually gets into the ontological argument as well. I'm just kind of throw that nugget out there. The ontological argument would say that there has to be whatever God there is would have to be the greatest conceivable being. And if you have a being that's in part morally is in part immoral, that can't be the greatest conceivable being. So the God of Kemeticism can't possibly be the real God. Anyway, we'll leave that aside. So first of all, they're building from an immoral framework, a moral foundation. Secondly, if everything is an expression of the one, all right, then that means you have a problem when it comes to living out whatever you believe to be moral truths. Okay, because on the one hand, they would say, all right, well, Christianity is a white man's religion. They beat religion, Christianity into so on and so forth. Okay, cool. But on your worldview, if everything is an emanation or expression of the one, then that means that whatever ancestors of ours was getting beat was an expression of the one. and the slave master that was beating them was an expression of the one. So you really don't have any moral high ground, because the entity that you subscribe to was responsible for whatever oppression you want to attribute to Christianity. So it doesn't matter like what evil you bring up in the world, what the white man did, what Christians did, whatever you bring up. If this is your belief system, whatever evil thing that you name that was enacted upon our people, the ultimate responsibility for that thing, it was expression of the one. That's what it was. And so now you have this being who is part evil and part good. You can't rely upon this being for having wholly good intentions. As a side note, for my theology folks, when it comes to the sovereignty of God, the stopping point of all events is a God who is morally good, right? And omniscient. And so you have a God who is incapable of doing evil and in the best position to know what will ultimately work towards his glory or not. With the one, that's not the case. Their stopping point from morality is a partly immoral being. So there's no reason for us to have confidence that whatever evil is going on in the world is ultimately for our good, because the source of that evil is indeed the one itself, that being that occupies the God's spot in their worldview. Lastly, if everything is a part of the one, us and evil included, that means that we, in so much as that we are part of the one, we're stained with evil. And that stain is not going anywhere. It's fixed in the very fiber of all reality. Isfet is a part of the one. So they can say all they want. Oh, look, yeah, you're divine because you're everything is divine as part of the one. But then they would also have to argue that everything is also laced with Isfet, because that's a part of the one too, right? So whereas on Christianity, it is the case that we are born in sin and shaped in iniquity. It is the case that, excuse me, that sin is a reality of the human experience. That we have human depravity to contend with, but there's an answer. Sin doesn't win on Christianity, because that was the whole point of the cross and redemption, right? Sin doesn't remain, all right, in that regard. When it comes to Kemeticism, there is no salvation from sin. There is no salvation from evil. There's because it's not going anywhere. You know what I mean? It's a part of reality itself. It's a part of the Godhead. Their God figure itself. And so on 3 counts, again, this is how they fall in terms of the human value issue. All right. Again, Christianity, we have a God who himself is good, unchangeably so, and conferred goodness upon us. And so we've got a secure foundation for human worth. In their case, their foundation for human worth is an immoral being. And spoiler alert, we're also laced with immorality as well, because Isfet is a part of the one just as much as we are. So obviously they have a lesser account of where human value can be grounded as opposed to the Christian perspective. You know what I mean? So on at least 2 ways, at least 3 ways, with Kemeticism, you're building from an immoral starting place, right? That doesn't give you a reliable, consistent guide in terms of morality, because both moral and immoral things are coming from the same source, right? And then thirdly, you have this non-erasable, I'm saying, that's probably not even a word, but non-erasable stain of evil, and they would say chaos or Isfet, that is a part of the one, you, and reality itself. Whereas in Christianity, the hope of the gospel is that in Christ, we are made clean, we are made whole, and reconciled to a good, loving, can't be gooder saying source, to whom we are reconciled. So I'm going to camp out there. Interestingly enough, and maybe I can give you this link too. I actually utilized this argument with Brother Jabari, because as I was studying Kemeticism, I was kind of picking up on this argument. So actually, funny enough, you can ask Vocab. I don't know if he remembers this or not, but Vocab was doing a chat or something like that, and Brother Jabari jumps in the chat and actually tried this argument out on him. And he didn't have an answer for it. And so like a year and a half later, maybe 2 years later, I don't think he realized that I was the same guy. And so when we hopped on Signetter, he and I were having a debate. Vocab was there as well, and I used this argument again, and he still didn't have an answer for it. And it was it's just really fascinating to see how this argument played out in that conversation. So I'll send that link so that people can check it out. But this is definitely one of the stumbling blocks. Like when you start taking the puzzle pieces of somebody's worldview and you show how they clash, then it's no longer about debating with Adam Coleman, right? It's no longer about debating with that Bible-beating Christian. You're showing them there's a problem in their own worldview that they themselves have to sort out. And that's one of the best ways to put a rock in somebody's shoe, and draw them ultimately towards Christianity, towards Christ specifically. Yeah. All right. And so I just want to put this up here. This is my, I've got one QR code with my website. And then on the left, is a podcast episode I had called God versus the Wu-Tang Clan. It was just a funny way of just kind of characterizing the argument for morality against different worldviews that you see swirling about in the African American context, particularly Kemeticism. I think I addressed in there, Hebrew Israelism and Islam, I want to say. So yeah, I'm gonna camp out there, man. And if you want to do questions, we can let it rock.
Yeah, listen, yeah, we snap our fingers already, y'all. This was just like mind-blowingly good tonight. I mean, Adam just like, man, jeez. All right, so gotta go back to the question we missed before. It was it just says iPhone. Anyway, question: what if one person? No, I'm sorry, we already won. We answered. All right, this one came from Rhonda Brown. She says, question: believing in evolution, there's no reasoning. So I don't know if Rhonda, if you're still on, if you want to elaborate on that, but again, it just says question: believing in evolution, there's no reasoning.
So was that a question or a statement? I'm trying to.
It's a question. I'm trying to say like with that type of belief, like is no truths in it, like no reality. I don't know if I'm making any sense.
Okay, so I'll try to answer it and just let me know if I'm not hitting the target here. So I think what we're looking for is, when we're talking with other folks, what is the best explanation for why things, like how things are the way they are, or why things are the way they are. An atheist particularly, and again, I'm just going to mention that a naturalist is like a particular type of atheist. I think it's probably the most prominent kind, are people who believe that the only thing that exists is the natural world. Okay. Now, if the only thing that exists is the natural world, then the best explanation of why human beings are here would probably be evolution. The problem comes in, and when we can challenge that's the best explanation, is that there are certain things that really just don't jive well with an evolutionist picture. One of which would be the fact that we have the ability to reason in as sophisticated a manner as we can. There's a whole argument called the argument from reason, that would say that the fact that we can do reasoning at all is evidence that there's something more to human beings than just the physical brain that evolution produced, And so that would be one reason. And then another thing is too, let me just kind of say this really quickly. When you think about evolution, it's all about biological order. Okay. It's supposedly nature ordering living beings in such a way that they can survive, Now, when it comes to evolution, that order relies upon a number of different things. And actually, I want to say Dinu could probably speak to this more so than I could. But when we think about like the genetic code, okay, you can't have evolution without a genetic code. And the fact of the matter is that code is exactly how it sounds. It really is a language. I'm saying it really is a code. Okay, there's an order. I mean, I've got a I want to say, I think I mentioned this also in urban apologetics. But you have different proteins: adenine, was it guanine, cytosine, and thymine or something like that. ACTG, and they're arranged in like an alphabet. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And you have certain aspects of the cell that, in a sense, read the code and then knows what it is able to do in order to make another cell to do this or versus doing that. I said all that to say, when it comes to a language or a code, we don't see languages or codes without minds.
Yes.
Right. So that would be like if I'm walking down the beach, let's say, yesterday was Valentine's Day. So let's say that me and my wife are walking down the beach on Valentine's Day, and we see just a pile of sticks just laying there. We probably won't pay it any mind, right? We just keep it moving. If we walk a little further, maybe we're talking like, man, it's just, there's a whole bunch of sticks up here. I guess the water just brushed it up on the shore or whatever. So we're walking and talking, and then we see another pile of sticks that says, happy Valentine's Day, Candace. I love you. Adam. Now, if my wife were to look at me and say, "Man, that's just crazy how that water and wind just blew all those sticks up on the beach and it to form those letters just like that," it just happened to be on Valentine's Day as we're walking by. That's amazing. That's awesome, right? that would be pretty irrational. Why? Because we understand that messages have a messenger, right? There's a mind behind it. That's the more rational way to look at it. So if you have this genetic code, which is literally a language, it's the language of biology, right? What's more rational? Is it more rational to infer or come to the conclusion that that code just kind of came out of random chance, or that it came from a mind? You know, I would argue that it'd be far more rational to say that it came from a mind. So for reasons like those, and we can give a bunch of others, but when it comes to the evolutions, I don't think the evolution by itself is the best explanation as to why human beings are here in the first place, particularly with the conscious or cognitive faculties that we have. I would refer people to, I'm trying to think what's the best book for that. Maybe I can just send a list of resources that'll kind of help with that question. That was super wordy. I don't know if that helped or not. I hope it did, but
if it didn't help
help me if
Rhonda, it helped me. I was just saying also, Adam, what's my man's name? Frank Turek's book, I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist.
Oh, sure.
Great job.
I think I have it right here.
Talking
Matter
about
of fact.
that. Yeah.
So somewhere behind me.
Yeah. Matter of fact, so just as a another gift to you all for registering for the conference, I'm going to copy that and I'm going to put that book also inside of your student folder for those of you that don't have it as well, just because Adam brought it up. All
right. I'm gonna bring up some more books. What else can I bring up? I got just read through the list behind me.
I gotta have a PDF of it.
Y'all gonna be rolling.
Listen, I done already loaded them up. So just for the sake of time for those that may have to run, I'm gonna go ahead and close out here. And then Adam, thank you so much for sticking around for the after party for however long you can.
For sure.
Because we still got other questions. So Tanisha, don't put your hand down. We gonna come to you. But I want to first, can we all just snap our fingers and say thank you to our brother Adam Coleman on tonight? Y'all see why? Listen, Celeste was texting me the whole time, all these memes and all that. I was like, you don't do that stuff when I be teaching, so it's again, this was really, really good, man. Like the TikTok videos I'm gonna make of this with this stuff tonight, it's gonna be insane. And definitely I'm gonna give you credit. But no, I really I love being a student and I love bringing in you all this week. It allows me to once again be a student, and I really just enjoyed, we all, I'm sure, just enjoyed sitting back and reliving this. This is one of them things. Now I kind of see what y'all be saying sometimes when I'm in class. I know that I have to go back and listen to this D-New 3 or 4 times. I'm over here taking notes and stuff to really grasp it, because I can cognitively understand it, but I really want to be able to internalize everything that you talked about tonight. But it was so rich. And so good, man. So thank you so much for the time that was invested into this. And I promise you all, as soon as I get those resources from him, I will drop them in your student folder. So are there any administrative questions that need to be addressed prior to tomorrow? Anybody not getting emails, no access to the student folder, anything that is for the good of the group that we need to address prior to letting you all go? And I will record the after party tonight and stick it in your student folder as well, since Adam's going to stick around to answer questions. All right. You're welcome, Joshua. All right. So again, as soon as you all got everybody got the recap email from last night. Yes, everything's working. All right, perfect. So the format, so that I don't have to type up a long paragraph that y'all ain't gonna read anyway and just go straight to the link. The format is always going to be the same. I'm going to give a short introduction, list the YouTube video, unlisted link, and everything like that. And it'll be done shortly after the after party is done. So Adam, if you wouldn't mind, my brother, would you close us in prayer? I'll close the recording and then we'll go straight into the after party.
Ooh. Well, Father, we just thank you for being a God of virtue, for being the very foundation of goodness itself. And thank you that you just, our very existence is predicated on a being who is loving, good, and the sum total of all that we could hope for. And you allow us to be reconciled with yourself forever, to be in relationship with you. So we just thank you for that, Lord God. I just ask that you bless everybody here. And also, whatever loved one or person they have in their life, Lord God, who they may want to, take this urban apologetics information and minister to them, Lord God. We just ask that those seeds be planted and that they be watered and that it really spring up into fruits of salvation. So we give you thanks for all these things. Lastly, Lord God, we just pray in regard to doubts, help us to wrestle well, with questions that we have and to be empowered by you to face even things that we're concerned about, unsure about, Lord God, and guide us toward your truth in a way that only you can. We give you thanks for all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.